Malik buys a $4 coffee on his way to work, like he does most mornings, without thinking twice about it. Nothing unusual. Same order he gets most mornings. What he doesn't know yet is that his account was sitting $2 short of covering it, and that $4 coffee is about to trigger a $35 fee. By the time he checks his phone at lunch, one small purchase has cost him $39 total, and he has no idea why the fee is exactly that size, or where that number even comes from. Here's the number that should stop you mid-scroll. Banks and credit unions collected more than $12 billion in overdraft and insufficient funds fees in a single recent year, and a small share of accounts, roughly 9%, generate close to 80% of all of it. This isn't a video telling you that every bank is secretly evil, or that overdraft protection never helps anyone. It's a video about a specific financial product, designed with specific defaults, that generates real, documented revenue, specifically from the people who can least afford to pay it. Let me show you how it actually works. My name is Alex, and today on Wealth Adjacent, we're taking apart the fee most people have paid at least once and never really understood. Quick disclaimer, not financial advice, just documented facts and public data. Not every bank operates the same way. Several major banks have eliminated overdraft fees entirely in recent years, and that's genuinely worth knowing. What follows describes a well-documented industry pattern, not a claim about any single bank you personally use. Let's meet Malik. Mid-20s, direct deposit paycheck, generally keeps track of his balance, checks his banking app fairly often. He's not careless with money. He just, like most people, never actually read the specific terms of his account's overdraft settings, because nobody sits down and reads those on purpose. Here's the part that should make you sit up. According to public data reported to federal regulators, the 10 largest fee-charging banks alone collected close to $5 billion in overdraft fees in a single recent year, with two of the largest banks each bringing in close to $1 billion annually from this fee category alone. That's not a rounding error in a bank's revenue. That's a specific, deliberate product line, generating real, predictable income year after year, from a fee most customers experience as a surprising, isolated mistake rather than as a business line item somebody budgeted for. Where does the concentration actually come from? Research into who actually pays these fees consistently finds they fall disproportionately on lower-income households and on customers with lower credit scores, who are statistically more likely to experience multiple overdrafts rather than just one. The same relatively small group of account holders ends up paying the overwhelming majority of total fee revenue, which means the product isn't really designed around the average customer's occasional mistake. It's structurally dependent on a specific, repeat-paying group. It's worth sitting with how unusual that concentration actually is compared to most consumer products, where revenue is typically spread broadly across a customer base rather than relying so heavily on a specific, financially strained subset of users. There's a mechanism specifically worth understanding here, and it comes down to a real regulatory distinction that most account holders never actually learn unless they go looking for it specifically. For debit card purchases and ATM withdrawals specifically, banks are required to get a customer's opt-in consent before enrolling them in standard overdraft coverage for those transaction types. Without that opt-in, a debit card purchase that would overdraw the account typically just gets declined instead. No fee at all. Which means the fee Malik paid on his coffee only happened because, at some point, often during account opening, he actively said yes to a setting that made overdrafting possible in the first place, frequently without fully realizing what he was agreeing to, or that declining coverage was even an option. And here's where it gets specifically uncomfortable. A meaningful share of customers report they don't clearly recall opting into overdraft coverage for debit transactions, even though records show they did, often during a fast-moving new account sign-up process where the opt-in question is presented as one screen among many, phrased in a way that can make declining sound like giving up a helpful safety net rather than what it actually is, a way to avoid the fee entirely by simply having the purchase declined instead. Now here's the part that turns this from an account settings problem into a psychology problem. And this is the part that should genuinely fascinate you once you see it clearly. The entire fee only becomes visible after the fact. Nobody sees a running warning that says this purchase will overdraw your account and cost $35 before they tap their card. The cost arrives as a surprise every single time, which means there's no moment of active decision-making to correct. No point where a person consciously weighs the coffee against the fee, because by the time either number is visible, the transaction has already gone through. A researcher studying how invisible costs affect financial behavior found something worth sitting with. People are considerably more likely to avoid a cost they can see coming than one that only reveals itself afterward, even when the after-the-fact cost is dramatically larger than the thing that triggered it. A $35 fee attached to a $4 purchase should, in theory, make someone furious enough to fix the underlying setting immediately. In practice, the fee gets treated as an isolated bad luck event, paid, and mentally filed away, rather than traced back to the specific account setting that made it possible in the first place. There's a specific mechanism worth naming directly related to how multiple transactions in a single day used to get processed, and in some cases still can be. For years, a well-documented industry practice involved processing the largest transaction of the day first, rather than in the order transactions actually occurred, which could turn what would have been one overdraft fee into several, since a single large transaction clearing first could push an account negative earlier than it otherwise would have, causing every smaller transaction that day to individually trigger its own fee. This specific practice became the subject of significant regulatory scrutiny and multiple lawsuits over the past decade, and many banks have since changed their processing order specifically because of that scrutiny, but it's worth understanding as the kind of design choice that was, for a long time, entirely legal and directly tied to fee revenue. None of this requires assuming bad intent from any individual banker or customer service representative. It's simply worth understanding that a fee structure this large and this concentrated doesn't happen by accident, in the sense that defaults, transaction processing order, and account terms are all things a bank actively designs, and design choices that happen to maximize a specific revenue line deserve the same scrutiny as any other deliberate business decision, even when no single person involved is doing anything they'd consider dishonest. A frontline employee explaining an overdraft fee to a confused customer is, in almost every case, just as removed from the original design decision as the customer is, which is worth remembering before directing frustration at the wrong part of the system. There's also a real regulatory history worth naming honestly. In 2024, federal regulators finalized a rule that would have significantly capped very large banks' overdraft fees, potentially saving affected households a meaningful amount annually. That rule was overturned by Congress in 2025, and overdraft fee revenue at several major banks has since risen again, according to public reporting on the same regulatory filings banks are required to submit. There's a specific pattern worth naming around grace periods too, since it shows up as a genuine improvement that still has a catch worth understanding. Several banks now offer a grace period, typically 24 hours, during which a customer can deposit funds to cover an overdraft before the fee actually gets charged. That's a real meaningful improvement over older account structures. The catch is that this grace period only helps someone who happens to notice the overdraft in time, which circles back to the same core problem: a cost that's invisible until it's already too late to act on tends to stay invisible, regardless of how generous the technical window to fix it actually is. There's also a low balance alert pattern worth naming specifically because it represents one of the more genuinely useful tools available and one of the least used. Most banking apps now offer a free, customizable alert that texts or emails a customer when their balance drops below a chosen threshold, giving real advance warning before a transaction would trigger an overdraft at all. A meaningful share of customers who experience frequent overdrafts report they never actually turned this feature on, not because it isn't available, but because nobody ever specifically prompted them to set it up during account opening, the same moment they were being prompted to opt into the fee-generating coverage instead. I want to be careful and specific here, because this isn't a story with one simple villain. Multiple banks have voluntarily eliminated overdraft fees entirely in recent years, introduced meaningful grace periods, or restructured their accounts around a small flat monthly fee instead, specifically in response to competition and public pressure. The industry isn't monolithic, and the specific bank someone uses genuinely matters to whether any of this applies to their own account at all. Alright, here's the section worth running through with actual numbers, because abstract statistics slide right off the brain. Malik's $4 coffee turning into a $39 total wasn't a one-time event. Once he actually looked back through several months of statements, he found he'd overdrawn his account 6 separate times that year, almost always on small, forgettable purchases: coffee, a rideshare, a streaming renewal, none individually memorable, each one costing $35 regardless of how small the original purchase was. 6 overdrafts at $35 each comes to $210 in a single year, on top of whatever the original small purchases actually cost. Money that, redirected into even a basic savings account instead, would have started building the exact cushion that prevents the next overdraft from happening at all. Here's the specific part worth sitting with: that $210 wasn't spent on anything. It didn't buy Malik 6 coffees, 6 rides, or 6 months of streaming. It bought him nothing at all beyond the privilege of a purchase clearing instead of being declined. A privilege he never consciously chose to pay for and, once he actually checked, didn't particularly want once he understood the alternative was simply having the purchase declined with 0 fee attached. So here's the framework I'd actually use. I call it the settings first check, and it takes about 10 minutes total, split across a few specific steps. First, log into your specific bank's app or website and look up your account's actual overdraft settings, not what you assume they are. Most banks list this clearly under account settings or account preferences once you know to look for it specifically. Second, see specifically whether you're opted into standard overdraft coverage for debit card and ATM transactions, and understand that opting out simply means those specific transactions get declined instead of approved with a fee attached, not that your account gets frozen or flagged in any way. Third, separately check whether your bank offers a linked savings account or automatic low balance alert as a genuinely fee-free backup, since many banks offer this specifically as an alternative that avoids the fee entirely rather than just delaying it, and set the alert threshold high enough to give yourself real advance warning, not just a notification the moment you've already overdrawn. A few additional practical moves fall out of that. If you've been charged an overdraft fee before, particularly a first one, it's worth knowing that many banks will reverse a single fee as a courtesy if you call and ask directly, especially for a long-standing account with an otherwise clean history, a request that costs nothing to make and succeeds more often than most people assume. If your specific bank charges relatively high, traditional-style overdraft fees and doesn't offer a meaningful grace period or low balance alert system, it's worth knowing that switching to an account at a bank that has restructured or eliminated these fees is a real, available option, not a hypothetical one, since several major institutions have made this change specifically to compete for customers who've grown frustrated with the traditional fee structure. And if you do want to keep standard overdraft coverage intentionally for the genuine peace of mind on essential payments, that's a legitimate choice too, as long as it's the choice you're actually making rather than the one that happened by default. It's worth being honest about the other side of this too. For someone who occasionally needs a purchase to go through even when funds are tight, standard overdraft coverage genuinely can prevent a worse outcome. A declined mortgage or rent payment, for instance, carries its own real consequences that can include late fees, damaged credit, or worse. The right setting isn't universally opt out of everything. It depends specifically on what a declined transaction would actually cost someone in their own situation, which is exactly why this deserves an actual, conscious decision instead of whatever default got selected during account opening. Now, let me address the objections directly, because I get them every time I make a video like this. First, but isn't overdraft coverage genuinely useful in an emergency? Wouldn't opting out just create a different problem? Completely fair and worth taking seriously. For specific high-stakes transactions, a mortgage payment, rent, a utility bill where a late fee or service shutoff would cost far more than $35, having the transaction go through, even with a fee attached, can genuinely be the better outcome. That's precisely why the fix here was never opt out of everything blindly. It's know your actual setting and make a specific, conscious choice about it, which for some people, honestly, might mean keeping coverage exactly as it is. Second objection: don't people just need to manage their money better? Isn't this ultimately a personal responsibility issue rather than a bank design issue, worth engaging with directly rather than dismissing? Personal budgeting habits genuinely do matter, and nothing here argues otherwise. Keeping close track of a balance remains a genuinely useful habit regardless of what any bank's settings look like. But notice the actual point being made isn't that budgeting doesn't matter. It's that a fee structure this concentrated, where a small percentage of accounts generate the overwhelming majority of revenue, suggests something beyond ordinary human error is happening at scale. A pattern that, consistent across millions of customers, looks less like individual carelessness and more like a predictable outcome of how the product itself is designed and defaulted. The actual answer was never banks are villains or budgeting doesn't matter. It's know your specific setting, understand what opting in or out actually changes, and make sure the choice on your account reflects an actual decision rather than whatever got selected during a fast-moving sign-up screen years ago. So here's where we land. This was never really about anyone being careless with a $4 coffee. It's about a specific product feature, opted into by default or by a fast-moving sign-up screen, that generates real, substantial, well-documented revenue, specifically from repeat use by people who can least afford it. The data doesn't say every bank is exploiting every customer. What it says is quieter and far more specific. A concentrated fee structure, where a small share of accounts generates the overwhelming majority of revenue, is worth understanding as a design outcome, not a coincidence, regardless of which particular bank someone happens to use. And if you're Malik right now, thinking back on your own version of that $39 coffee, hear this clearly. You're not careless, and you didn't do anything unusual. You interacted with a product specifically designed to make a fee-generating default easy to accept and easy to forget about, during exactly the kind of fast, low-attention moment, opening a new account, that almost nobody treats as a high-stakes decision worth scrutinizing closely. Of course, the settings slipped past you. It was one screen among many, phrased to sound like a benefit rather than a cost. Seeing the actual mechanism clearly is most of the battle, and it's a battle that takes about 10 minutes to actually resolve once you know where to look. Malik checked his own settings, discovered he was opted into standard debit coverage without ever really deciding to be, and switched to having those specific transactions decline instead, keeping a small backup transfer set up from savings for the situations where he'd actually want the purchase to go through on purpose. The coffee habit didn't change. What changed is that the next small purchase that would have overdrawn his account simply doesn't go through anymore. Instead of quietly costing him $35, he never agreed to pay in any real, conscious sense. Check your actual settings. Don't assume the default was ever really a choice you made on purpose. And don't feel embarrassed if you've never checked before, since almost nobody actively chooses to review it without a specific reason to look. Reverse a fee if you've never asked before. The call costs nothing and works more often than people expect. And the next time a friend mentions getting hit with a surprise overdraft fee at their own bank, you'll actually know the specific mechanism behind it, instead of just another isolated bad luck story nobody ever traces back to its source. If this helped, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, did you already know whether you're currently opted into overdraft coverage on your own account? I'll see you in the next one.